like to welcome everyone back for this second panel discussion. I think as we did in the first case, we will forego introductions. You've got information on these folks, and if you don't know about them already, shame on you. I noticed that Joe Capizzi gave a shout out to the University of Virginia. I would be very remiss if I did not, as a Baylor Bear, give a shout out to the Lady Bears, who just won the national title. In fact, I had alumni warning me that I wouldn't get out alive if I didn't mention that. So I'm sorry I didn't lead with that great news. But we're delighted to welcome for this afternoon panel Jonathan Haidt, Candace Vogler, and Robbie George. And I'm going, as we did this morning, we're going to start off with some opening comments, and Jonathan's going to go first, and then Candace, and then Robbie, and then we'll let them respond to one another a bit. I may ask some follow-ups, and then we're happy to take questions from you all, again, as we did in the morning. So, Jonathan, please, where are we on this issue, and how did we get here? Thank you for being with us.
Okay, well, thank you, Tom. Does it feel to you as though things are coming apart, not just in a sort of like a steady way, like it's gotten worse and worse, but as though there was somehow like a phase change or a wrinkle in space-time at some point in the last few years? Raise your hand if it just feels like something weird is happening. Okay, so I'm going to try to, I'll give an explanation of this. I've been studying polarization since 2007 or so, and things really got weird very recently. I think it'll help to go back in time and to tell the story two ways. So first I'm going to tell you the story of how we got here over the course of several million years, and then over the course of about 90 years.
Condensed version, please.
And then I hope that will set us up for more specific conversations. So the 90 million year story is this. Human beings are primates that clearly evolved to do hierarchy. That comes very easily to us. But then we have this long period in our evolution where we live as egalitarian hunter-gatherers. And during that period, there's a lot of group versus group competition. Human nature is shaped by multi-level selection. That is, we're competing against others in our group, but our group is competing against other groups. Even more so than, this is true even more so for us than other primates. So we are shaped to be tribal creatures. This is my point. Tribal creatures, one of the secrets of our cooperation is sacredness and religion. That is, bees and ants and wasps are ultra-social. They live in gigantic groups. We're the only other ultra-social creature. We're the only one that does it without being sisters and brothers. And we do it through religion. At least this is what I argue in my book, The Righteous Mind. Okay, the point is, we evolved for tribalism organized by religion and competition at whatever level the competition is. Keep in mind the Bedouin proverb, me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me, my brother, and cousin against the world, because that's human nature, okay? And this human nature is very flexible. We can live in lots of different ways. And the founding fathers, who are going to try to give us a framework for living in a different way, and they called it an experiment, and they were very good historians. They knew that democracies almost always decayed into tyranny, and they did not want to give us a democracy, because they understood human nature, passions, faction, they called it, our tendency to faction or tribalism. So they were very aware of this, and they gave us a structure that they thought would resist it. So that's story one, the beginning of this experiment to create, for us tribal primates to live in a way that dampens down the tribalism and minimizes it with lots of cross-cutting identities. Now here's story two. Story two is you take this sort of rickety, not likely to work experiment, and things change over time in ways that you think would kind of break it apart. You can think about a large, secular, diverse democracy as like a giant spaceship that shouldn't fly, a giant airplane that just it shouldn't fly. But clearly it has flied, it has worked, so we know it's possible. But here's my point. The margin of error, I think, is very, very small. If you get the conditions exactly right, a large, secular, diverse democracy can function. It has functioned. But always keep your eye on the forces pulling us together, and those we can call centripetal forces from physics, and the forces blowing us out. That's centrifugal forces. So the 90-year version is we go back to the Great Depression, at a time when liberalism and democracy were thought to be rather ineffective compared to those muscular, effective fascists and communists. So there was a period of great doubt as to whether the founders were right, as to whether this experiment was going to work, and it looked pretty grim. But then we win World War II, we fight the Cold War, we win that, we have extraordinary economic success, and by the late 20th century, we were fooled into thinking not only was this easy, but this is the only viable alternative. We started talking about, is this the end of history? Meaning, eventually Iran and North Korea will be like Denmark or the United States. There is no other path forward, so eventually we're all going to be liberal democratic societies. We were fooled because temporarily in the late 20th century, a lot of centripetal forces lined up. The media has always been a polarizing force in our country, full of lies and garbage, except for a few decades after World War II, where we had, because of this new medium of television, 3 networks, laws limiting them to be nonpartisan. So temporarily, journalism was a centripetal force for a few decades, but that begins to go away in the 1980s when cable TV comes in, and boy, is it gone now. Having a common enemy is the most powerful centripetal force, and we did for much of the 20th century. And then in the 90s, we searched around. We tried drug dealers. That didn't work very well. We tried child abductors. We never, Osama bin Laden was, for a while. But we never really found a good enemy that can unite us. Now we've got enemies, but they divide us. So the loss of a common enemy. Changes in our political parties where they became totally separated by left-right. My point is, the 1980s and 90s was a historical anomaly. And to the extent that our political culture and our public square have decayed since then, we should be looking not just at what's happened since then. We have to realize it was an unnaturally high period then. So I do all this not to completely depress you, although I am completely depressed. I say this to make clear that the challenge we're talking about today is an extraordinarily big challenge. It is solvable, but the margin of error is small. There's no quick fix, as Robbie and I were saying beforehand. And we've got a lot of work cut out for us. But it has to start with an understanding of human nature, which is that by default, we're tribal primates who use our reasoning not to find the truth, but to manage our reputations and manage our fight against your group. Okay, let's discuss.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay. Let's see. I share the pessimism that it's going to be at all straightforward to remedy things. But happily, I'm in a field where nobody agrees with anybody ever. I'm a philosopher, right? So reason disagreement is not unfamiliar. It's the stuff I live with all the time. I have a similar set of premises with a slightly different metaphysical background, although I believe in evolution and so on. I'm kind of a Thomist. That means I've learned a lot from Thomas Aquinas, from reading and working with the thought of Thomas Aquinas. And the first thing you would notice if you read Thomas Aquinas carefully is that we're a mess, right? We've got all these different bits. And there's a strong sense in which the bits are kind of made to work together. But our situation is one in which that almost never happens. And no matter how hard we work on self-improvement, the chances are that even if we're sort of beautifully governed, self-governed individual human beings, we mess up a lot, okay? So we're a mess, all right? And that's in our nature as the kinds of creatures that we are. I think that part of what's gone wrong, say, in the last 20 or 30 years, as near as I can tell. Now, I'm a philosopher. For the most part, we don't have data, we have anecdotes. Okay? But I catch a lot of different anecdotes. I read pretty widely. So it looks to me like it's not just that somehow emotion has overtaken reason. I don't think they're as cleanly distinct as some people do anyway. I think that there tends to be an element of judgment in any actual emotion as opposed to like a mood or something. I think it's that all of the sphere where we're interacting with each other has been thoroughly moralized. I take it that I want to share the thought of one of the last questions in the last session about the need for moral virtue being kind of crucially important. I think that as human beings, as near as I can tell, ethical self-image is incredibly important, right? It's one thing to believe rightly that in some respects you're very ignorant. In some respects, you're frequently or occasionally or way more often than is entirely comfortable, less than fully rational. But to believe that you're morally bad is one of the most corrosive things that can ever happen to you. I spent an awful long time doing volunteer work with mostly abused women, okay? Back in the very early days of there being shelters for such people. And the thing I noticed right off is that it's one thing to have to heal from like broken bones and shattered jaw and all these kinds of things that can happen, the physical harms. You can heal from that. If you become convinced that you're morally bad so that you deserve to be treated that way, that's a kind of damage that's really hard to heal from, incredibly hard. So I think that we live in fear of being bad, actually morally bad. That this, I mean, even Kant can tell you this much, and I'm not a huge general fan of Immanuel Kant, that we have an incredible interest in altering our sense of ourselves to try to appear like we're on the good side, always on the good side, whatever that side is. When you suffuse the whole of the world of kind of cultural disagreement, public disagreement, political disagreement with this very strong moral tinge, it's not just that I get so angry at the people on the other side, it's that if they're right, then not only am I wrong, or a little bit wrong, or at least in some respect wrong, but probably I'm bad. And that charges public discussion in a completely untenable way. So I think that the very centrality of ethical self-image and how we all are with ourselves individually and collectively is also a place where there's some room for remedy. If you can at least start facing the people who disagree with you vehemently about things that matter a lot, with the understanding that it matters very much to each and every one of us to be a good person, then thought about goodness in a kind of general way, because there is no idiosyncratic thought about moral goodness. It's got to be suffused across some generality of humanity, provides a way to start having a conversation. And that's what I try to do all the time in my teaching. It's enormously effective. I actually have no idea what the exact political or moral views of most of my students are, but we all start with an understanding that we're all bringing some set of ideals or something into the classroom with us, and that there's an enormous, overwhelming amount of empirical evidence suggesting that none of us lives up to our own standards very easily. And from there, there's a place to start, where we're all respecting each other as, trying to be good. And the difficulty is in figuring out how to actualize our own senses of what that means in our lives.
Robbie?
Like Candace, my training and most of my work is in philosophy. But I am appointed at Princeton in a social science department, in the Department of Politics. So Candace, I've been able to observe the social scientists close up, almost like an anthropologist, I would say. And I've worked out, took me a while, but I've worked out what our social science colleagues mean by data. data is the plural of anecdote. Once you get hold of that concept, we're there. Let me begin by just saying a heartfelt thank you to Baylor University for reaching out to me and partnering with me. Now we're 2 years into the initiative on a project that is meant to enhance the public understanding and public discussion of important issues like the ones that we're talking about today. It's really been an honor to work with you, Tom, and with the team, Grant, the whole gang, Molly, the whole gang in doing this. It's been a blessing for me, and I'm grateful. And congratulations to the Lady Bears. I feel like I'm one of you guys.
Yes,
So,
indeed.
Congratulations to the Lady Bears. Please join me in congratulating Tom Hibbs on his appointment to the presidency of the University of Dallas. That is a huge loss for Baylor and a loss for our initiative. And what a gain it is for University of Dallas and for what Dallas represents in American higher education, which is something very, very important. Tom will do a brilliant job there, and just wish you all the best there, Tom. Also, I want to say something about two more of my friends who are here. One is Allison Stanger, who was on the last panel. Never in my life have I seen a better example of someone who has used something that happened to her that was deeply, profoundly evil to make a lot of good come out of it. Allison, as she mentioned, as I'm sure most of you knew without her mentioning it, was attacked by the mob at Middlebury during the infamous encounter there. When Charles Murray spoke, Allison was meant to be Charles's interlocutor for a discussion. She was severely injured. It took her nearly 2 years to recover from those injuries. And what has she done with that? She has not shown rancor or even anger. She must have felt some. But rather, she has used that experience to become not only a spokesman, but also a role model for how we should conduct ourselves in academia. And if I can add this, I hope I don't embarrass you further, Allison, but she's also, for those of us who are Christians, and Allison herself is a Christian, shown us what it means to be a Christian who forgives the people who did you wrong. I've heard Allison express empathy toward, a desire to understand the people who attacked her. I mean, I know in theory we're supposed to love our enemies. I don't get that. That's hard for me. But part of how I know that's possible is I've seen what Allison has done. And then finally, John Haidt. Nobody, just nobody has done more in the cause of reforming higher education in the ways that it needs to be reformed, restoring the integrity of academic life. No one has done more than John Haidt. John, I salute you for what you do. It's just fantastic. Those of you who aren't keeping up with John's work and the work of his friends and colleagues at Heterodox Academy, please go to the internet. It is of some use. Social media. Go to the internet, find out about Heterodox Academy, follow its Twitter feed, and if possible, get involved in the work that Heterodox Academy is doing. It's crucially important work. Now, John mentioned this great experiment in Republican government and ordered liberty that we call the United States of America. And he made reference to something very important that all of us as Americans need to understand. Our founders did self-consciously reject not only the option of monarchy once they had improbably overthrown the greatest military power on earth and established their independence. They rejected not only monarchy, they rejected democracy. And they rejected democracy because they understood the evils of democracy to have to do with the mob, with mob rule. They were worried about the sort of thing that very dramatically happened to Allison at Middlebury. Mobs are not good. So they opted for this thing, Republican government, which I think we can call, because of its deep and powerful democratic elements, Republican democracy. I think that's a pretty good way of referring to what we value and treasure and want to uphold. But as John pointed out, they were fully aware that all previous efforts, not only at democracy, but at Republican government, had failed. And they failed for a particular reason: the descent into faction. Faction is the great danger. Why were so many people, even at the time, reluctant to go along with the Republican government idea? Favored some sort of, they hoped, benign autocracy, a benign despotism, rather than Republican government, because they had seen Republican government fail and fail and fail again in the ancient world, in the medieval period, in the Renaissance period. And yet our founders thought that by, among other things, and that among other things will become important in a second, that among other things, they could construct a constitutional system whose structural constraints on power would enable democracy to survive the tribalism that they referred to as faction. Read the 10th Federalist paper. It's all written down right there. But note that I said, because they said, that those structural constraints were necessary, among other things, to preserve Republican government. It's one particular other thing that I think is so crucial to us today, and it's the thing we need to restore, and it's what we're all about here. That something is civic friendship. Civic friendship. And civic friendship both is a civic virtue and is a condition of civic virtue. If you look again at the Federalist, at those essays written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, those op-ed pieces, they were, believe it or not, op-ed pieces, published in New York newspapers to try to persuade the state of New York to ratify the proposed Constitution. If you look, you'll see that the structural constraints, the separation of powers, the system of federalism, the novel and interesting and profound idea of the national government as a government of delegated and enumerated powers rather than a government of general jurisdiction exercising plenary powers, that in addition to those structural constraints, and possibly a Bill of Rights, which they did add as amendments afterward, in addition to those, civic friendship was needed because those structural constraints were auxiliary precautions. They were auxiliary precautions that had to be in place. Why? Because of the defect of better motives. But they were auxiliary, secondary, not primary. If the better motives don't exist at all, if we have not only a defect of better motives, but a complete absence of better motives, all the best structural constraints in the world will not enable Republican democracy, liberty, to survive, because the natural tribalism whose causes John explored will cause people to destroy each other. That's what will happen when citizens understand themselves as enemies because of their differences, rather than as civic friends who disagree. Now, nobody needs me to tell you, or any of us here to tell you, that civic friendship has been largely lost, not only in our academic institutions, and it's not just universities. As I said to our friend who asked the last question in the last session, I've noticed that students come pre-indoctrinated to places like Princeton, already in the grip of ideology, already prepared to dismiss people who disagree with them as bigots or ignoramuses, or as tools of nefarious interests, or as people who are purely self-interested. This is coming to us. We don't need to indoctrinate them at the university. They already come pre-indoctrinated. So it's deep, and it's not just in the universities, it's in the schools, and it's in the broader culture. That statistic the business about us moving so rapidly from 15% of respondents saying they hate people in the other party to 50% should frighten the dickens out of each and every one of us and steal our resolve to say, no, we're going to do something about it. Now the question, of course, becomes, what do we do about it? Okay, well, let's begin the old-fashioned way, the way we lead our own lives, the way we conduct our relationships in academia and outside with other people, the way we conduct ourselves on social media. I haven't always been perfect about this myself, I must admit. Reaching out to friends we disagree with and not just dismissing them, making friends of people we disagree with, even profoundly disagree with. And this includes, by the way, the cases where it's hardest, where our disagreement is within a particular community that we belong to. There's nothing more violent than the rivalry of brothers. So if you're like me, a Catholic, and in my case, a conservative, you know, I can get along with my secular liberal friends or my Protestant liberal friends or my Jewish liberal friends. My Catholic liberal friends, they're not my friends. So I have to discipline myself. To listen to them, see whether they might have something to say. Consider why they've reached the position they've reached. Engage. Not with just the, you know, tea and sympathy sort of approach. I think our dialogues need to be robust. They need to feature that factor that the Greeks called parrhesia, frank speech, candid speech. But we can't just dismiss people. So on our personal lives, we have to do that. In our institutions, again, starting with our academic institutions, but not just our academic institutions, we need to find ways to create infrastructure to model the kind of intellectual engagement that we believe is the antidote to tribalism and is the way truly to pursue truth. And around the country, I see people doing that, both within the institutions and as Heterodox Academy is a good example of, in the supra sense, that is, getting national organizations that bring together people from all sorts of different institutions. One of the things I love about Heterodox Academy is it's not all conservatives. John, I think it's not a majority conservatives.
No, it's 20% people on the left, 20% people on the right, 25% centrist, 25% libertarians, and the rest are unclassifiable.
There you go.
We are the only evenly balanced institution in higher ed that I know of.
That's so critical to do, and it's why I encourage you to get to know and get involved with Heterodox Academy. And then, bit of good news. I know we've had a lot of bad news today. Bit of good news on the academia front. Any good psychologist, clinical psychologist, will tell the patient, client, until you acknowledge you've got the problem, we're not going to be able to deal with this problem. The first thing you have to do is get them to acknowledge the problem. For a long time, academia has not acknowledged the problem. Problem? We don't have a problem. It's hard to get any academic leader. There were a few professors who were dismissed as cranks who said, you know, we've got a problem. We have no viewpoint diversity. Everybody's thinking alike. We're starting to trample all over academic freedom. We're letting people shout down speakers, not even invite speakers who dissent from the campus orthodoxy in the first place, and yet no one would acknowledge a problem. Finally, good news, we've got serious, important academic leaders acknowledging that there's a problem. Not only Bob Zimmer at the University of Chicago, that great institution that Candace serves, where you would expect it, given Chicago's history and so forth. My own president, Chris Eisgruber at Princeton University. President Ron Daniels at Johns Hopkins University. President Michael Roth at Wesleyan University. Chancellor Judith Christ out at the University of California, Berkeley. The fact that these leaders are saying, we've got a problem. We're the echo chamber. I mean, that used to be a term that disgruntled conservatives would hurl at academic institutions. Now it's academic leaders, most of whom themselves are political progressives, who are saying, we've got a problem. There's an echo chamber. We've got a problem. There's conformist groupthink going on, dominating our universities. That's a big deal. It's a big deal to have major figures leading universities who are saying that. Now, I think it's up to us. It's up to students, it's up to faculty members, it's up to citizens. These universities all pride themselves as serving the nation. It's up to us to make sure that it's not all talk. All right, President Zimmer, President Eisgruber, President Roth, Chancellor Christ, what are we going to do about it? We're happy to help as alumni, as friends. If you have initiatives, we'll provide financial support as alumni, we'll get behind you, but we need something to get behind. So those who do acknowledge the problem, I think, have to be recognized, and we have to offer our help in assisting them. And then what about the broader public sphere? I think here role modeling is critically important, and praising, holding up the role models is important. When people on the right or on the left, and the spectrum is actually more complicated than a right-left spectrum, but lay that aside for now. When people on the right and on the left do stand up in the face of the groupthink, in the face of the tribalism, and do the right thing, whether you actually agree that it's the right thing or not, when you might be on one side of an issue, but yet nevertheless recognize that someone has done something praiseworthy, when they break with you, but in breaking with you, break with the tribe. You know, you might criticize the content or substance of that decision, but you can praise them, you can hold them up for being willing to act on conscience when conscience told them don't go along with the tribe. I think the people who do act on conscience should be praised. Yes, virtue is its own reward. I got that, that's fine, that's true. But they should get some additional auxiliary awards as too, which is things like the praise and recognition of, and we need to be willing to, in fact, we should be in the forefront of offering that public praise. We've got social media, so like we're all journalists now. We can offer public praise to people on the other side who say or do the right thing. Also, and I'll conclude with this, when people come under attack, even if we disagree with them, in ways that reflect that tribalism and lack of respect for conscience and lack of respect for freedom of speech, we should be in the forefront in speaking out in their defense. If someone's rights are being trampled, whether it's their rights to academic freedom in a university or freedom of speech in the public square, or whatever it is, the question is not whether you or I agree with what they said. If their rights are being trampled, we need to stand up for their rights. It's hard to do when there are people on the other side. We recognize the offense when it's an offense against someone on our side. We need to recognize the offense when it's an offense against someone on the other side. Most of the cases I know in academia these days of people's rights being trampled, the conservative is the victim, and the folks on the left are doing the trampling. But there are cases in which it's someone on the left who's the victim, and the rights are being trampled for other reasons. We need to speak up, and those of us on the conservative side need to speak up in those cases, just as those on the progressive side need to be speaking up more when it's people on the conservative side whose rights are being trampled. End of sermon.
Thank you. I think this is yes. Not often that sermons get applauded. This is good. That's a new trend. We'll hope that continues. I think this is a great lead-in for us to hear some hopeful things from Jonathan about the work he's been doing and where you see signs. I want to give Candace, though, first of all, an opportunity to respond to what Robbie said. Candace, I was struck. You can respond to this question or anything that strikes you, but I was struck in your comments about the way in which you attempt to establish certain conditions for conversation amongst your students. I wish more of us thought about that when we walked into a classroom. What are the conditions that are actually going to make for a fruitful interchange of ideas and among students? Would you describe what you're doing there as establishing conditions for civic friendship? I mean, what are you trying to do, and what do you see coming of that over the course of a semester? You can respond to that or anything that struck you in what Robbie just said.
Thank you. The only community I have direct control over is the community in my classroom. Whatever classroom I've got, that's the community where I'm at the University of Chicago, right? It's like faculty are demigods at the University of Chicago. So I have control over that community, and I need to establish a repertoire of how we do things in this room and with each other And I've got lots of techniques for doing that structurally. I've got lots of techniques that I do it as an educator who cares about my students, most of which they know nothing about. The class roster is my student prayer list for the month before class starts. So I'm looking at those faces and wishing well to each one of those people every single day for a month, which means that when first I meet them, even though class rosters are like mugshots or something, they're not perfect likenesses, I can usually start by greeting some of the students by name. When they, even if there's 80 of them in the classroom, I don't mind long session of petitionary prayer for the sake of my students. Why would I bother? Why would that be a problem, given that these are the people that I've been handed to work with for 10 weeks, right? We always greet each other at the beginning of each lecture. These are big lecture classes. You have to greet the people on either side of you. And I say, after the fashion of human beings who are in a room together, we greet each other. We've got structured ways of handling class discussion. We've got all these kinds of things. It's a whole series of things where you do not need to be a virtuoso teacher to do them. These are flat logistical things that anybody can do. And I mean, okay, if you don't have a prayer thing that you do, you could at least think about them, think well for them, send good thoughts their way as you look through. I mean, that's also a reasonable meditation on the people you're about to be responsible for in a serious way. I mean, because our students are undergoing very profound personal and moral formation. It's not just their intellectual formation, which my university does a pretty good job of overseeing, but moral formation is happening whether we're thinking about it or not. And if you start thinking about it, then you're in a position to try to help. And the biggest way to help for any kind of moral formation is to create a thriving community of people who can figure out how to engage with each other across differences. That's actually the support you need for personal development. Maybe it is playing on a weird kind of tribalism. Maybe it's making an us out of that classroom. Because they certainly take pride in the way we do it. The way we do it in our classroom is this way. The professor knows who we are before we walk in the room. In our classroom, we greet each other. So if a visitor comes into the classroom, one of the members of the class is going to make a point of going and greeting the person. Because any human who walks into that space deserves to be given a welcome, right? And every human who's in that space deserves to be given a welcome. Friendships form all this kind of stuff. So I would understand that as a way of trying to produce conditions for civic friendship in a room full of people who don't know each other and have very little in common when they first walk in. These are introductory philosophy classes. That's what the big lectures are, okay? So I completely agree that some sort of learning how to get over yourself enough to be able to develop some sense for a community is absolutely critical to moral development, and that I'm completely deluded if I don't think that part of what's going on in my classroom is moral development. I'm just ignoring a thing that's happening there, and that we need to do this together. So I completely agree with you. Now, do I know how to do that in the city of Chicago as a whole? Not so much. My little sphere of influence is really pretty limited. It's, at my university, it's in my department, it's in my division, in those sorts of places. I am not a big public intellectual, but I am somebody who works really hard on producing a community for my students and for other people's students in a bunch of extracurricular programming.
Thank you. Good tribalism to counter bad tribalism?
Yeah, so I think we're making a lot of progress here. Here are two themes that I think tie together the morning session and this one. With civic friendship and, so relationships and communities, this is one theme. I think this is the biggest piece of what we can do and what I think we can really talk about here profitably. So what Robbie didn't mention when he talked about civic friendship is that his friendship with Cornell West, who's a very progressive professor at Princeton, they came to like each other personally. They take their show on the road. It's an inspiration to the country. And so last year at our first Heterodox Academy conference, we gave out 5 awards, and you guys, was it the Courage Award or I forget which award you got, but it was for it was for this friendship, the two of them. We wanted to recognize this is so good for us to see people who are different, but who actually enjoy each other's company and recognize that they each make each other smarter. So bravo, thank you for that example. Broadening that out from a dyadic relationship, civic friendship, to the idea of community, this morning we had somebody use the phrase, I think, sacred canopy, something like that. And that's a phrase that I first heard. I spent a year teaching at Princeton. That's where I first met Robbie. I spent a year, and I ran a conference on political polarization, and I tried to find a conservative. And I think, I don't remember if you were not available then. Were you at the conference that I ran with?
No, I was
you were out of town. Yeah, you were out of town.
I was out of town. That was the problem.
And so he's the only conservative there. So so I tried calling all kinds of foundations, and I finally got this guy, David Blankenhorn, from the Institute for American Values, and he came in, and he used a very similar phrase. And it was the most powerful phrase of the conference. The idea was, if we have a canopy, if we're under a shared canopy, all sorts of things are possible, rather than if we're just yelling at each other out in the open. And whether that canopy is Christianity, or religion in general, or Princeton, or the academy, or something, you have to have something. And more, so the warp in the fabric of space-time for us is that so much of our interaction now takes place in the worst possible environment, which is interactions with strangers temporarily on the internet, where there's no past, no future, no canopy, just trying to show off for other people. It's the worst possible environment. So the more that we focus on civic friendships and more generally communities that have the resources to have the discussion, and all the work you do to create that canopy, that's a lot more than I do for my classes. I'm going to start trying to do more of what you do, because now that I see it's not just this difficult thing of memorizing names, it's weaving the canopy. It's getting ready for a great class. So thank you for that. I want to just add on to this discussion. Now, so that's the first thing, is focus on relationships and institutions. That's where we can do this work. The second thing is I wanted to just add a quote. As Robbie said, the founders talked about this, with this one, but what do you say, with this additional consideration of civic friendship?
Oh, yeah. So the idea is the constitutional structural constraints can help us to deal with the effects of faction and stave off the collapse of republicanism, but they won't work by themselves. They're merely auxiliary precautions to remedy the defect of better motives. But you still need, they're auxiliary. What's primary if they're auxiliary? It's civic virtue. It's an attitude that the citizens have that enables them to treat each other as fellow citizens.
Okay, so where does that attitude come from? I want to read to you a quote from E.D. Hirsch, who wrote about the importance of an education
theorist.
Theorist at the University of Virginia. He writes, "The history of tribal and racial hatred is the history and prehistory of humankind. The American experiment, which now seems so natural to us, is a thoroughly artificial device designed to counterbalance the natural impulses of group suspicions and hatreds. This vast artificial trans-tribal construct is what our founders aimed to achieve, and here's the key thing, and they understood that it can be achieved effectively only by intelligent schooling." So we have to look at our educational institutions at all levels. We had a question before about 4th grade, I think it was. At all levels, we have to be preparing our students to have these kinds of civic friendships, to see that they are part of this ongoing experiment whose future is not assured. And I think, continuing the discussion from this morning, the more we bring a sort of a common enemy identity politics, divide people by race and gender, you stand over there, you stand over there, we're going to do privilege training. The more we do that, the more likely this is going to completely crash to the ground and burn. So I think we need to be thinking about education for democracy as if it is precious and fragile, which it is. And I think that in some corners of the education world, we are making things worse, much worse. But I think we're beginning to recognize that, and I think most people are pretty sensible. And if we can find ways to, as Allison said, if you stand up, it's amazing what happens. Many other people are thinking the same thing, but they're afraid to stand up. So if we can stand up, be courageous, be polite, be moderate, it has a ripple effect. And I think if this is what we take home from I'm actually feeling a lot better now than I was when I walked into this conference.
Let me add a point to what John has said there. I think it's most people belong to multiple communities, not just one community. It's not just we're American citizens. For most of us, there are at least a couple of things that are even more important to us than our status as Americans, our status as American citizens, which is not to say that we're not good patriotic people, but that's in third position behind faith and family. Right? Those are more primary. They're even higher for us. I think what happens in faith and family is critical to the success in the political or civic sphere. Where do people learn the virtues that enable them to be civic friends, to be good citizens? Where do they acquire those traits or those habits of heart and mind? Not directly from the political system itself, or if so, only in a secondary sense. It's from mom and dad and grandma and grandpa. And it's from my faith as a Jew or as a Christian or as a Muslim or as a Buddhist or whatever. All these great traditions, philosophical and especially religious traditions, have, I believe, within them the resources for the kind of education, the kind of virtue inculcation that will make people good American citizens, and we need to rely on those traditions. Now, part of what that means is not pushing those traditions, not using political power to push those traditions to the margin, or to privatize them, or to say what goes on in religion should have nothing to do with what goes on in the political sphere. I think we're finally past that. It's taken us a long time in academia to get past that. I think we finally are. But now I think that the space has been carved out for religion to play a proper role in American public life. It's up to these traditions of faith and people operating in them to draw on those resources within the tradition. Very fundamental things like the principle of equal respect, the principle that all of us in fundamental worth and dignity, whatever differences we may have in intelligence and beauty and skill and prowess and so forth, that in the most fundamental sense we are, to use the words of the Declaration, created equal. That's a very important point. It's a profoundly important point for politics. But if it's really going to be alive in the hearts of our citizens, it's going to be put there by faith and family. People drawing on what's in their tradition that affirms that great principle of equal dignity.
I like that. Oh, Candace, please go ahead.
Okay. I'm just going to speak out as somebody who was from a completely disastrous family. Like no human being should undergo the kind of early childhood and adolescent life that was the situation of myself and my 4 siblings. And I've got a pretty strong character, actually. It may not be showing, but it's sort of actually there, okay? In terms of faith, it was a kind of multiply denominational Protestantism where we were traveling from church to church to church to church, basically in flight from the 60s and early 70s as I was growing up. So while it's elements of faith and family that have been enormously important to me my whole life long, right? I do not feel like that was actually a very clear foundation, except in the sense that we were, myself and my younger siblings, were pretty clear that what this was not good. I mean, like, no, it shouldn't be the case that you have to miss school a month at a time because you're too injured to leave the house. That shouldn't happen. It's not okay, you know? So I think it's not, I mean, I certainly agree. And I've spent an awful lot of my life coping with the after effects of family situations that are not good for anybody.
Yeah. No, as it happens, I do know about Candace's background, and that's been the case for far, far too many people. But that's why my plea to families and to traditions and communities of
yes.
faith is to do it right.
Oh,
We
yeah.
don't have a better way of doing it, but they can certainly fail. I mean, traditions of faith can become incubators of the kind of tribalism that results in violence and war. But
Yeah.
those same traditions of faith in many cases can also be the opposite. It depends on what the particular believer pulls out of, what
I agree.
resources are pulled out of the tradition. So families have to get it right. Faith traditions have to get it right. But we need them to do it. Civil society, see, I guess this is the point. Political society's success vitally depends on the healthy functioning of civil society. It's a point, it's not original with me, it's as old as Tocqueville, probably actually as old as Aristotle,
Yeah.
but it's critical.
No, I mean, I agree. I wasn't. The thing about having a lot of experience with disastrous families is that it makes you value the ones that are working reasonably well all the more. It just makes you hyper aware that that's not inevitable.
Should we?
Well, not quite yet. I think we still got a few minutes for our conversation. Jonathan, I wanted to. I like that you were feeling more hopeful here this morning. And I think we all know, you said toward the end of your comments before Robbie responded to you that we all know the problems in education that are obstacles to what you're advocating. What are other signs, not just in education, but do you see things in the wider political culture that are, I'm hoping you'll say yes to this at least with some degree of enthusiasm, are there hopeful signs in the wider political culture on these issues?
There's one. So the general answer is no, almost all the trends are in the wrong direction. But there is one that makes me hopeful, and that is that both here and in Britain, it's very much the same dynamics. It turns out that African Americans are quite diverse, and Muslims are quite diverse, and women are quite diverse. And while, I forget who said, there's a narrative about, there are many narratives for each group, but only one is allowed to be said on campus. That was true until very recently. But now that we have crazy right-wing identity politics, racial identity politics, now that since Charlottesville, I'm seeing a lot more scholars on the left, or at least members of identity groups, professors, writing and saying, wait a second, this is nuts to have race-based identity politics play this role in the United States. And so a bunch of books came out in the last year. Francis Fukuyama, what's the title of his book on identity? I forget what it's called. But Francis Fukuyama, Amy Chua, John McWhorter has been writing brilliantly about this. There's a group in Britain called All in Britain. Irshad Manji just has a new book out called Don't Label Me. So we're seeing people of color, intellectuals, professors, saying, now wait a second, this isn't necessarily a matrix of oppression. Actually, there's a lot of great things about America and about life here, and things are. So I'm just saying, diversity actually. If you scramble diversity and you don't have this rigid idea about people are diverse based on these 8 dimensions that are the canonical ones, then it turns out that there's a lot of original thinking going on. A lot of people realize we're in a crisis. It is a crisis for which ideas, and often ideas that came out of universities, are at the center. In general, I'm alarmed. So here's the 2 reasons. Okay, I got to be a downer a little bit. The two reasons that I think it may not come fast enough, or that we're in big trouble, are one, the Democratic Party is now radicalizing in the same way that the Republican Party did previously. Now, there's debate over this, but a lot of political scientists say we used to have a sort of a center-right and a center-left party. The Republican Party has been changing a lot over the last 20 or 30 years to the point where many people, especially center-right and center people, don't want anything to do with it. And that might be happening now to the Democratic Party as well. We don't know. So our parties are clearly polarizing. And the other reason why I'm alarmed is that Gen Z, the kids born after 1995, they bear absolutely zero responsibility for the mess that we've made, but they are likely to be much less adept at dealing with it than even we are, and we're pretty bad at it. And this goes to I wrote a book with Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling the American Mind, and because we have protected kids so much from stress, from being excluded, from teasing, with the best of intentions, we've protected kids so much. People send me photographs. I just got a photograph of at a playground in California. 12 rules for how to play tag. 12 rules for how to, because we don't want any fights to break out. That would be terrible. Can you imagine if kids had a fight? Like, what if they learned something about getting along? No way. So I think we only have about 5 or 10 years to solve this. Once Gen Z becomes a big part of the political class, maybe in 15 years, I kind of think it might be game over. So we really got to solve it. We really got to get a handle on this quickly.
There's absolutely nothing about identity politics of the right or left that I like or find salutary. But among the very worst things about identity politics is the pressure on young men and women who count as minorities to conform their thinking and behavior to what is expected of them. You're black, this is how you're supposed to think. You're Muslim, this is how you're supposed to think. This is now the party line. The pressure to conform is bad enough for young people. I mean, just think of how young people are often said to be naturally rebellious. This is the opposite of the truth.
That's right.
I mean, if you
Yeah,
want
no,
to test
they're
that, just
utterly
look at a young kid who
conformist.
realizes he's bought the wrong pair of sneakers, right? It's a disaster. So there's natural pressures to conform anyway, and identity politics really ramps those up. So I think it's important, especially for those working within minority communities, to make clear to a couple of people here, Noor Goda and Ismail Royer, who are working on that in the Muslim community, making sure that young Muslims understand that there's no party line here. You should be serious about your Muslim faith, but that doesn't mean you have to believe in this or that or the other policy just because it corresponds to what other Muslims say this is our line is here. And that's the same true in the black community, in the Jewish community, in any community. There's always that sort of pressure to conform, and it's gotten much worse.
Maybe we'll take some questions. Do we have a microphone here? Right here. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I'm wondering what if civic friendship, lack of civic friendship and lack of interest in rational disagreement is the strategy? How do you then deal with that?
What do you mean by that? Is the strategy? Whose strategy?
Meaning that if you engage with someone, labeling you is part of that strategy, so there's still the debate.
Well, that would get into just the way that fundamentalists often work. When I said that human nature is small tribal groups based around sacred objects, maybe it's a river or a tree or a rock or an ancestor, the whole suite of cognitive adaptations for religion include blasphemy laws, sacrilege. For some reason, the most satisfying thing to do is to burn people. I don't know why that is, but it's just there's something satisfying about burning people who are blasphemers or who commit sacrilege. And so we see that in a small way on campus too. We should note, for however bad things are, there's very little actual violence. I mean, what happened to Allison was horrible, but there's only really about 5 or 7 cases you can it's not like the 60s when there were bombs going off everywhere. I mean, there's a lot of intimidation, but there's not a lot of actual physical violence, thank God. But the psychology of it, the psychology of blasphemy, so this word cancel that all the kids use now, if you step out of line, you're canceled. That means like socially you no longer exist. And so it's this urge to not engage in debate. And that's what I was actually very scared when I wrote The Coddling the American Mind. When I was writing it, I thought, this could be the end of my career. If I'm not sympathetic to the student movements, this could play out such that I will be, an outcast. Nobody will ever have me in to talk with the university again. And it's turned out that's not true at all. And in fact, it's been surprising that nobody's argued against me. Pretty much there's been almost no pushback. And the reason, I think, is that they have no idea how to push back. They will not read the book because, the people who would hate it, they will not read it because that'd be morally impure. So they have no idea what I'm saying, and they have no idea how to make an argument against me. So it's actually been a cakewalk.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. What we have to resist with all our might is conversation stoppers. Now, a conversation stopper in a certain community might be the Bible says. Okay, that's over. In another community, it might be, well, that's racist. In another community, it might be, oh, you're just engaging in identity politics.
Yeah.
That itself could be a conversation stopper. So if someone is willing to engage in a conversation, we shouldn't dismiss them on any of those sorts of grounds. Let's just have the conversation. So much of the current strategy is to stop the conversation from happening. Make sure that certain conversations don't happen, because that unsettles what has been, quote, achieved, unquote. Might or might not be right, but the people who have, quote, achieved it, unquote, are absolutely sure it's right, and they don't want that achievement to be disturbed, so they don't want the conversation to happen. And I think what we have to insist is that the conversation happen. There be no conversation stoppers. There should be conversation starters, no conversation stoppers. I think all we should ask of each other is that our interlocutors agree that business in this conversation or in this intellectual community or in the civic sphere, that conversation will be conducted in the proper currency of intellectual discourse. That's a currency that consists of evidence and reasons and arguments. It's not shouting, it's not name calling. I think we can legitimately say that kind of stuff is out of bounds. But as long as you're willing to give evidence, reasons, make arguments, no matter how odious the parties might believe each other's ultimate position to be, they need to be willing to engage with each other. And by engage, I don't just mean respectfully sit quietly while they speak. I mean actually listen to what they say, consider whether it might be, if not true, have at least elements of truth in it. John Stuart Mill, who Candace has written about so brilliantly, John Stuart Mill noted that we have a great deal to gain in engaging with someone who's a critic of ours, not only on the possibility that we might be wrong and the critic might be right, but even if we're right and the critic, well, certainly if there's a mixture in our view of some truth and some error, but even if we're 100% right, we gain by hearing what an intelligent critic has to say about our view. We'll come to a deeper understanding of why what we believe is true and what its larger significance is by listening to an intelligent critic who's just wrong about it. I think Marx about most things, Karl Marx about most things, was really profoundly wrong and really tragically wrong. And I think of the death toll and the corpses that have piled up. And yet, I value very few things more than hearing my views critiqued by a really smart critic operating out of the Marxist tradition with the resources and conceptual tools of Marxism. Not because I think maybe they're actually right, but because I know I'm going to learn a lot from that experience, from that conversation.
Other question?
Yeah, I just want to come back to civic friendship. Other than seeing great role models and having great teachers, just putting those two things to the side, you started to get into this with playgrounds maybe, but what are some of the concrete experiences that Americans of earlier generations had that gave them the habits of civic friendship with people they disagreed with on important stuff that you feel like the kids these days might not be having as many of?
Well,
Again, outside of the classroom and outside of just having good moral role models around.
Well, I mean, Robert Putnam wrote a lot about the decline of social capital, and he paints a picture of American society that had lots of civic organizations. People lived in communities with people of different politics and different social class. This is also in Charles Murray's Coming Apart. And as we've sorted into lifestyle enclaves, we live near people who share our views about using health clubs and yoga, things like that. And as people have gotten busier, and as women no longer focused on the domestic sphere but joined the workforce, for a lot of reasons, we don't have the time, we don't have the relationship, we don't have the real civic groups that put us into contact with lots of different people. Faith and family have declined, at least as religious in terms of organized practice, and marriage has declined greatly. So in some ways it's been replaced by associations online, but at least as I was saying before, at least what I think, is that these are usually ersatz. They're worse than nothing in many cases. So I think that's part of this. Just sociological changes have deprived us of the kinds of rich internetworks of real face-to-face relationships with people who you are tied to, at least by the fact that we expect that we're going to see this person again year after year, as opposed to just temporary, I don't care about them.
I think if we look at our history, go back to things which were profoundly important at the time, like John Adams representing as counsel the soldiers, British soldiers responsible for the Boston Massacre. Of course, people were outraged that Adams would do such a thing at the time, but Adams was doing the right thing for the right reason, and when passions cooled, people realized he had done the right thing for the right reason, and that sent a message about the importance of rights over tribalism. It was the tribal impulse that said, no, you know, a patriot should not be defending in court these horrible people, these not only our enemy, but people who committed a massacre. But Adams did it, and that sent a message to the whole nation. Look at Lincoln's second inaugural address. I mean, Lincoln could have been beating his chest and saying, you know, because it was clear at that point, by March of, the inaugural addresses were in March in those days, not in January. So by March of '65, I mean, it's clear, Lincoln has won a great victory. He saved the Union. There's no chest beating. No, it's with malice toward none and with charity for all, in a context where certainly the victorious Northerners wanted to punish the South, and we saw what happened in Reconstruction when Lincoln was assassinated and was unable to carry it out there for himself. But in that context, in that passion, in the most tribal moment we have ever had, Lincoln rose to the occasion. There was nothing accusatory. When he came, even when he kind of walked up to the accusatory, saying it's baffling. In effect, it's baffling that anyone could defend earning one's bread by, or taking one's bread for the sweat of another man's brow. What's the next sentence? But let us judge not, lest we be judged. You know, it's an amazing thing, and what a lesson to the nation Lincoln provided there. And again, you know, at the time, not everybody thought that was the coolest address in the world or the right attitude, but when passions cooled, we look back, and generations were taught a profound moral, anti-tribalist moral lesson there. And there are other examples that we could cite. And there are even some today. I mean, if I mentioned the ones I particularly like, I think some people would agree with me that they're great, and other people would think of me that's just a traitor. But we need them. We need that kind of modeling.
I wanted to say that one other big, profound social change from the time of my father's generation to now is compulsory military service. Compulsory military service was an amazing leveler in a lot of ways. It was huge. And it built really profound kinds of, now it's not anti-tribal, but it certainly expands the tribe, you know. And it seems like the combination of compulsory military service, which among other things made it be the case that the military wasn't this mysterious black box to ordinary citizens, that most of them had been in it. So there was a profound sense of both the strengths and limitations of the system of organization that was the U.S. military in a time of war. That, I mean, I have nostalgia for a time I wasn't in that was a pretty difficult time in a lot of respects, just in the sense I don't know that I would object to there being some kind of compulsory service for people that you actually couldn't buy your way out of, and that you couldn't get excused from on the grounds that, oh, now you're a college student, so you're obviously doing something more important.
One more question.
Thank you so much for organizing this very urgent and indispensable talk. My name is Nora Goda. By trade, I'm a secondary school teacher. I teach juniors and seniors within the Fairfax County public school system, and really appreciated the question that was brought up by the parent in the previous panel. I wanted to go back to the point made by Dr. George about faith and family, and to connect it to what Dr. Vogler was describing regarding the classroom culture that she sets up. I think certainly it would be the ideal that we are continuing certain values, morality, and ethics at the family and faith levels, but for the reasons that modernity has caused, there is now this institutionalization and indoctrination of children that happens very, very early on. And so, in essence, we as primary and secondary education teachers are becoming, for lack of a better word, surrogate parents to students. They spend more time with us than they do with their parents. And so there is, whether warranted or unwarranted, a responsibility that teachers and now professors have adopted in teaching morality and ethics. It goes beyond just the content and the knowledge and the skills that we're responsible for teaching and the curriculum that we're supposed to be executing. And so my question is twofold. To what extent at the level of post-secondary education are professors aware of this and or disgruntled by the fact that now they have to do this relationship building with students and it's not merely about teaching their content? And at the same time, how do we as educators get around the policies and regulations that pigeonhole us into perpetuating the victimhood culture and identity politics? Because we as public school teachers suffer very much the same sort of intimidation and reprisal that happens in academia. So I would just love some advice.
Well, I'll start off by saying that we don't necessarily feel that we have to do this moral education. The alternative is simply to disengage and withdraw because trust has been sucked out of the system. And now that some students will be videotaping you in class and you don't know, are they on the right or the left? They're surely on one or the other. There's no reason otherwise to do it. But is it going to show up on Breitbart or is it going to show up on some campus? So when you don't, and where I teach at New York University, we have a bias response team, and that means in every bathroom there's a sign telling students how to report me. And so I've responded by I just don't do anything provocative, just play everything straight. I just disengage. If you don't, trust makes things work well, and if you suck the trust out of a system, then people just sort of phone it in, do the minimum. That's what I do.
Well, I don't disengage. The phrase separation of church and state does not exist in the Constitution of the United States, but the concept is in fact there. It's been very, very badly misinterpreted historically, including by our Supreme Court going back to 1947, very often in the context of disputes within public education, very often. But it's important to get it right, to have a proper understanding of the separation of church and state, or the idea of no establishment of a particular religion. I think what has become clear, at least to me, and I think to many people, is that we do have an established religion institutionally, including, and perhaps most notably in our public schools, and that established faith is an ideology. It's not a formal religion. It's secular progressive ideology. Now, secular progressive ideology, secular progressive may be true, it may be false. But it deserves to be debated in competition with other views, secular and religious, on the merits. It shouldn't be permitted to function as an established religion into which children are indoctrinated, often against their parents' own belief, in our public schools or in other institutions, or in institutions that advertise themselves, as most of America's most influential universities do, as non-sectarian. You know, I believe in truth in advertising. If you've got an official doctrine, let the customers know that you've got an official doctrine, and they can decide whether they want to buy the product, which risks doing something I shouldn't do, which is treating higher education on the consumer model. So I apologize for what I just said. But I think one of the big challenges, Nora, and everyone, for us, for this generation, is to pull back the curtain on the functioning of secular progressivism as a state religion, as an established church, especially in the public schools, and figure out how we establish fair terms of debate so that people representing that view, including parents who have that view of the world, those principles, how do we set fair terms of debate where students and parents on that side are treated no better and no worse than Muslims, than Jews, than Christians, than Buddhists, than Confucians, people across the range of secular and religious viewpoints. What we have now is highly unsatisfactory, it is unfair, it's wrong, and in my view, it's unconstitutional. Now the question is, what do we do about it? Now I don't think the answer is to establish some other religion, but we've got to come up with a way. The most heroic, I think it was a failure, and I was a pretty harsh critic of it, but I think the most heroic effort to deal with that problem was by the late and very great Harvard liberal political philosopher John Rawls, who in his later work, especially in his book called Political Liberalism in 1993, tried to find a stance, he called it political liberalism, which could be distinguished from what he called comprehensive liberalism, what today we would call secular progressivism, which was one that was fair in the way I am saying we need to find the fair route to all the competing traditions, liberal and non-liberal, secular and religious. My criticism was that his so-called political liberalism ended up collapsing back into comprehensive liberalism, so it didn't pass his own test. But even if I'm right about that, and Rawls didn't quite get it right, he had the right project. And from our different perspectives, we need to be working on that project.
Candace?
Oh,
Well, I mean, do you have
no, I was thinking about Rawls, but I certainly.
well, anything on Rawls, whom I know you know well, or on the broader question about the character formation of students or deformation?
I mean, just that my youngest sister is a public school teacher in Chicago, so I am sort of acutely aware of the incredibly only nominally coherent set of restrictions that govern her teaching. But even with those and a number of them that are special to her particular, she's now in a magnet school. In her magnet school, the possibility of actually producing human connection with her students and between her students has not been defeated by the welter. And that connection is the biggest gift that she can help give her students and help them learn to give each other. And I think that just that capacity to gradually mature into being able to engage with your fellow human beings as your fellow human beings, she teaches a second, third, and fourth grade classroom, is very, very powerful. Any teaching question I have, I take to her, because I feel like the challenges that she faces are greater than anything I face in my classrooms.
Thank you. Jonathan, Candace, Robbie, thank you very much. Wonderful conversation.